So it was a kind of civil war situation, really,
Yeah, it was
in every
sad,
possible way.
yeah. I mean, there's on record that, you know, brother fought brother and father fought son.
There's kind of vibes coming out. Why don't I stop him and do it properly?
No. It's going to be 53 metres long.
It's what?
53 metres in length.
That's half the main street, isn't it?
It is.
And all of a sudden I just have a vision of doing something, and I think that's the garden finally getting into my thoughts and saying, this is what we would like.
A proud native of the place that I'm in today was giving a talk to the local Heritage Society back in 1982. And he said that for him, one of the best things about the town was that it was a finite place. You're either in it or you're in the country. What he meant by that, I take it, was that the town had very well-defined boundaries. It was self-contained, surrounded by miles of open greenery that kept it apart from the sprawling conurbation of the greater Belfast area. His underlying anxiety, I suppose, was that his town would become merely a suburb of the city, its own identity becoming merged and ultimately lost to sight within the much larger entity. That was 35 years ago, and I think it's fair to say he needn't have worried. The place that I'm in today is assured of its own integrity, because the people who live here and who care about it are acutely aware of their own heritage and have forged for themselves a well-defined and enduring image of its unique character. Welcome to the parish and the town of Saintfield in County Down. Saintfield has remained a finite place, still a comfortable commute of less than a dozen miles to Belfast. A crossroads hub encircled by Lisburn and Ballynahinch to the west, Comber to the north, Killyleagh to the east and Downpatrick to the south. About 400 years ago, what is now a busy main street would have been impassable, thick with oak trees stretching all the way from the Lagan Valley to the shores of Strangford Lough, a territory of the Clandy-Boy O'Neills, which was confiscated by the Crown and granted to Sir James Hamilton, who proceeded to plant the area with English and Scottish settlers. In those days, this was a townland known as Tonnockneve, a name translated as Saintfield by Major General Nicholas Price, who bought the land from the Hamiltons and built the first town here in the year 1712. It's a fairly typical Ulster story thus far, and not in itself the stuff from which to forge that unique character I mentioned at the outset. The clue as to what that might be is to be found in the form of a kind of heraldic announcement at the entrance to this finite town, depicting a centuries-old conflict that has a particular poignancy for Saintfield. Not only because this was a site of one of the battles of the 1798 rebellion of the United Irishmen, but also because this was the birthplace of the man regarded by many as the progenitor of the radical ideas that inspired that rebellion, and who also had a profound influence on what became known as the Scottish Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the American Declaration of Independence. The Reverend Francis Hutcheson became Professor of Moral Philosophy at Glasgow University in 1730, but he was the son and grandson of Scottish and Ulster Presbyterian ministers, and he spent his formative years growing up in the manse at Saintfield, an experience that Martin Todd is convinced had a nurturing effect on Hutcheson's genius for thinking the unthinkable in 18th century Europe.
In my view, and of course I would be biased, he's not only Saintfield's most important son, he's probably County Down's most influential person on the way that we all live together in the Western world. He influenced the evolution of liberal democracy in a way that was just amazing. He was born here in his grandfather's manse in 1694. He did his early schooling in Saintfield. He then followed Hans Sloane to the Presbyterian Academy in Killyleagh.
Would he have known Hans Sloane? Would they have been co-contemporary?
No, there had been about, I think they're about 8 or 10 years apart.
Between them, right.
So he would certainly have known of Hans Sloane, but Hans Sloane might never have known of him then.
Yeah.
But Hutcheson then went on to Glasgow University, and he studied there for 6 years, firstly natural philosophy and then theology, as you say, to become a Presbyterian minister.
Yes.
But he was then diverted from that and set up and ran a dissenting academy in Dublin for 10 years. And it was during that time that he studied and corresponded with the major philosophers in Europe and wrote his first book, which this is a copy of.
Oh, that's the book that you're holding.
Yes.
This is actual.
This is a fourth edition.
A
so
fourth
this
edition,
dates
right?
from 1738.
So he was still alive when this was brought out.
Oh, he
in
was,
other words.
definitely, yes.
Right.
And it was in this that he set out some of his thoughts that were so influential. The first of which got him into a lot of trouble at the time, where he said there is innate goodness in people, and therefore you can trust them to govern themselves.
And this ran counter to the received wisdom of the day.
Absolutely, because
Right.
the received wisdom was, no, we're all sinful, you cannot be trusted to look after yourselves, only a God-appointed bishop or archbishop or a God-appointed monarch can look after you. But he actually says in this book in one place, no amount of wealth or righteousness gives a man the right to govern others. So
That was heady stuff back in the mid 1700s, wasn't it?
Oh, it really was.
Yes, yeah.
And the other quote, and I'll read it to you from the book, for which he's most famous, if I can find it here, page 181, was the foundation for the utilitarian philosophical school. So he says here, that action is best which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. And that really is the pillar of liberal democracy.
See, so many people, Martin, would know that phrase, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people.
Yes.
They wouldn't have a clue where it comes from.
No.
It came from Francis Hutcheson.
Came from Francis Hutcheson, and he was read and admired by Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, the second president, and Benjamin Franklin. They're all on record as having read and revered what he said.
Was he just one of these outstanding geniuses who lived 100, 200 years ahead of his time? Or what influenced him to come to have this kind of thinking?
He definitely was way ahead of his time. He was the first person in Europe to write against slavery. He wrote about animal rights back then. But I actually like to think that part of it was his upbringing in Saintfield. His grandfather, with whom he spent a lot of time, was a very interesting man, very tolerant man, and it was a very tolerant society here. General Price, who had been a general in the Williamite army throughout Europe, and he had soldiers fighting for him of different races, different religions, different nationalities, and he brought that tolerance to Saintfield as well.
I see, right.
And in fact, after the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, you weren't allowed to build Catholic churches in Ireland, and that was turned around. And one of the very first Catholic churches that was built after 1690 is here in Saintfield. So I mean, even in that sense, it was ahead of its time, but also the church was largely funded by Presbyterians in the area.
So Francis Hutcheson would have grown up in a kind of an atmosphere of tolerance.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes.
And of acceptance of other people.
Yes.
And this notion that he had, about authority and about the nature of human beings, really, I suppose. Some of that was his own, I suspect, but he was influenced by what happened to him in the place as they grew up as well.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, some ideas were considered more dangerous than weapons of war, because the only way that Hutcheson's philosophical and political ideas could be put into practice was by challenging the government of the day, and if necessary, by confronting it with force of arms. Such ideas found fertile ground among some of the radicals within the Ulster Scottish Presbyterian tradition, and the Reverend Thomas Ledley Birch, minister of Saintfield First Presbyterian, formed a branch of the Society of the United Irishmen, the first outside of Belfast and Dublin. Martin Todd and I are standing in the 1798 Memorial Garden by the river in an area of the graveyard known as York Island, so called because the bodies of York fencibles are buried more or less beside the bodies of the local Presbyterians, members of the United Irishmen, all killed in the Battle of Saintfield, which occurred on the 9th of June 1798, and which was a victory for the rebels. 4 days later, the insurrection was over in County Down when the United Irishmen were defeated at the Battle of Ballynahinch. Much of the town was destroyed in the aftermath of the Rising, but Saintfield was a resilient community, and less than 40 years later, a new parish school was built beside the former battlefield across the road from the graveyard. It's nowadays home to Alison Lowry and her family, and in a studio at the back of the old school, Alison practices an art form that couldn't be further removed from battles and bloodshed.
Alison, I'll start with some of the finished articles, first of all, which I think are absolutely beautiful, especially the colours on them. What do you call those? Do you have a name for that particular process?
This particular process is Pâte de verre, which is French for glass paste. Right. So it's a really ancient way of casting glass that goes right back to Egyptian times. It was first found. And then it sort of rose to prominence again in the sort of 1900s in France, hence the French name. So to make a Pâte de verre vessel, we'll use crushed glass. So this is frit. Mm-hmm. Yep.
This looks like, you don't mind me saying, washing powder or something like that. Not unlike it.
Yeah.
So that's crushed glass.
That's crushed glass. So glass can be crushed like right down to a powder, and it looks like icing sugar.
This is different colours of Pâte de verre. Mm-hmm. Does it come with the colour already in it?
Yes, the glass comes with the colour. You can sometimes get interesting reactions in the kiln. You can see, if you look carefully, you can see a lot of red flecks in this, but there's no red glass.
Can I take that down in a second? There's permission before I touch anything. The kiln gives it this sheen?
Sadly not. No, sadly not. It comes out of the kiln, it's reasonably rough, and then what I have to do is I have to polish it up.
Sorry, I'm just picking up this one.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
That's the way it comes out of the kiln.
That's pretty close. It's had a little bit of work, but not half as much as this one. You can see this surface is much more refined.
And you polish that, in other words.
Polish it,
right.
Yeah. It's quite slow.
I see, right.
So this is where these big vessels, they're quite expensive, and that's really where the money is in them.
They're still decorative things. They're not functional as such.
No. Pâte de verre is not really functional. It's porous. And that would be one problem with it.
You mean water falls through it?
It can be porous.
And also, as you say, there are some things that you try and spend probably hours and days at, and they don't turn out as well as you would have liked them to turn out.
That's continuous.
Well, come here.
It doesn't stop.
You haven't seen anything yet, because you're going to get me to do something.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
This will be fun.
Well.
All right.
What followed was a crash course, and I use the term advisedly, on making a Pâte de verre object. Alison is well used to teaching people, but it does help if they have a basic aptitude for the craft, which involves shaping the powdered glass evenly round a mould, ensuring a uniform thickness, ensuring there's no air gaps, and ensuring that you put it into the kiln at the right temperature and leaving it for the right amount of time. That'll be overnight in my case, so I have to call back to see the result of my nervous labours before I leave Saintfield. And before I leave Saintfield, I have much more to see, including the beautiful Rowallane garden, when we come back. If you take the road southward to Downpatrick out of Saintfield, you'll soon encounter the welcoming entrance to Rowallane Garden. 50 acres of pure joy for gardeners, ramblers, locals and visitors alike. It was begun by the Reverend John Moore back in the 1860s, dutifully and lovingly enhanced by his nephew Hugh Armitage Moore in the 20th century, and is now cared for by the National Trust, whose own precepts chime perfectly with the Moor's original founding principle, quaintly expressed in this preserved sign. This garden is for the pleasure of the people. Rowallane was named after a castle in Scotland owned by an ancestor of the Moors, and it means beautiful promontory, an appropriate description of a landscape famous for its rock garden wood. It's also famous for its walled garden, its rhododendrons, its farmland walk, its wildflower meadows, and it should be famous for having Avril Milligan as its head gardener. Avril believes this garden has personality, character and a mind of its own, and her job is to fashion a meeting of minds.
I find, I'm out in this garden, it actually talks to me. I know that sounds weird, but there will be something that will come through. I'll be puzzling about a problem or whatever else, and it'll come to me in a couple of days later whenever I relax enough and think it through, and all of a sudden I'll just have a vision of doing something, and I think that's the garden finally getting into my thoughts and saying, this is what we would like. So I often think I'm not the head gardener here, the garden is.
That sounds a wee bit like Michelangelo cutting his statue out of the marble, you know, and all he was doing was releasing the statue. It was always inside the marble. Did you see what I mean, right?
Right.
So this garden it's an ideal garden, and you're just trying to find out what the ideal is. Is it something like that?
It tells you what it wants, and the more you get into it, the more it talks back to you about what is best for it.
Hello, how old is this garden? You're talking going right back to the 1860s or something like that?
In around 1860, yes, the Reverend Moore actually bought a townland of Creepy Loch Air, and he built a modest house. He built his stable.
Excuse me, a modest house?
Well, that was a modest at the time,
right.
A modest 2-storey house at that stage. He also built the stable yard behind us, and he also did a lot of the stonework. The tiles in the wall garden here, I mean, it's very unusual for a wall garden to be as close to a house in Irish domains.
Right.
It changed over into the second owner, Hugh Armitage Moore, so this garden became more ornamental in Hugh's time.
Right.
So he was here from about 1903 up to 1955, and then the National Trust took it on in 1956.
Does more ornamental mean more exotic kind of trees that you wouldn't see naturally and so on?
I would refer to it as less edible.
I was very pleasantly surprised, and not having been to Rowallane Gardens before, and the name Rowallane Gardens sounds very formal. You know, it sounds, I expected to see sort of, you know, very clipped kind of appearance, manicured lawns and all that. And it's not like that. No. There's a natural feel to it all, a flow to it all. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. We're on top of rock everywhere within the garden, so no matter where you go, even if you go to plant a tree in the garden, you have to actually experiment if you've got enough depth to plant. So it dries out very quickly in the summer months as a result of that, but it's a clayish type soil, and it's rich and it's acidic, so that's why we can get away with growing what we do grow, because of the clay content.
Right.
I'm always trying to sort of release views and vistas and sort of try and get a better balance between the mix of evergreens and deciduous plants, because that gives you a lovely change of season. And the seasonality is what brings people back time and time again. That's what gets us out of bed in the morning.
Does it lift your heart when you come out at this time of the year to see all of that? I mean, or is that just now, that's just business, you know?
It can never be business, because I think whenever you're a gardener, it comes from the heart. There's nothing nicer than coming in on a Monday morning and seeing what has happened over the weekend. And that momentum and movement that comes up through in the spring is absolutely gorgeous. But at this time of the year, really, even 12 hours is a big space of time. You just see the trees coming further and further out in leaf, because you've got all of that bud break.
The name Rowallane has been borrowed by another organisation in the town, again for public-spirited purposes. The community hub is a fairly recent arrival, but the fact that it's thrivingly busy is a sure sign that the need for it has been long-standing. Brian Graham is one of the brains behind the whole enterprise, and it sounds like they've not only provided a much-needed amenity, they've also restored one of Saintfield's historic sites.
2010, when we moved in, we came through the back door of that building, and the weeds were up to about this height.
Where we're sitting now,
and
seriously?
That archway there was a cattle feeder blocking it, and it took us 3 weeks to get all this cleared away. And this building behind us had no roof.
Right.
And it was covered completely in ivy, and the whole place around here was covered in ivy. And behind was a farmyard.
Apart from anything else, Brian, it's making use of an old building in the town and making use of the town's facilities. It was been
derelict from the fellow that owned the sweet shop, and the front died in '83.
Aye.
And just led derelict from that.
But before that, you were telling me this building, or the front part of it anyway, would have been the house in which the Prices lived in when they first came to town?
The Price family owned the building next door to it, and this one. Next door was the Saintfield, where the stagecoach used to come in.
Right.
And this was where the family actually lived before they moved out to the mains.
So it's an important part of the history of the town, really.
But at one time it would have been the most important
the hub, literally.
The number one house in the village.
Indoors, it's all go. You name it, we do it, is Hazel Bland's motto. Knitting, sewing, painting, craftwork, armchair aerobics. That sounds great to me. Is that when you sit in an armchair, literally?
Yes,
and you
more
do
or
all
less,
exercise?
yes.
Right.
And very popular.
And they get something out of it, seriously?
They do. They all enjoy it. This hall's filled.
Right. And there's another thing here, another project that you're part of, right? And there's a bit of it that really behind us here,
yes.
Right? And I don't believe that's a sock.
That's the Northern Ireland big sock.
Right.
that's creating the largest Christmas stocking, and it's for the Guinness World Book of Records. It's trying to break the world record.
So you're only a part of that?
I'm only a part. I just put pieces onto it. Pamela at the top there, she is the organiser of it. It's going to be 53 metres long.
It's what?
53 metres in length.
That's half the main street, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Seriously?
Yes.
So all these ladies in here behind us now, they're all doing different kinds
They're all
of
doing
crafts.
different. There are quite a lot of very experienced crafters in Saintfield.
Some very good ones.
So they do everything from sewing, crafting, making cards, scrapbooking, as you see, spinning, all kinds of crafts.
The great advantage of having something like this around the hub is, of course, it brings people together.
It brings people together.
So,
that was the purpose behind it.
Right. So there's a lot of exchange of news and views and gossip
Yes,
and all that sort
and
of stuff as
combating
well.
loneliness too. There's an awful lot of people living on their own in small rural villages like
Yes.
this, and this brings them all together.
All this craft work reminds me, I have one more call to make in Saintfield before I leave. Remember Alison Lowry and my Pâte de verre creation?
That's it, it's covered in talc. There's not much we can tell at the minute.
Okay. So that's all reusable?
So that's all reusable.
Even though it's been baked?
We can
So
say, look,
Right.
there you are.
Ah.
Your very first piece of glass.
I'm very pleased with that.
Isn't it very
Lovely,
nice?
lovely,
Nice
sort
colour.
of pale blue.
Yes.
That's
There you are.
There you are.
Joe.
That's
Oh,
lovely,
lovely.
delicate. Hey, that's also icy looking, if you know what
It
I mean.
is, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful.
I mean, the pieces of frit that we were working with have just fused together.
Yes.